What's going on, guys? It's Nick here, back with another video. It's Thursday, it's time for another player breakdown video. This week, we're taking a look at Tee Higgins versus Chris Olave versus DeVonta Smith. If you have a trio you want to see next week, please put in the comment section below, upvote the responses you agree with. So, let's start things off with Tee Higgins. As I mentioned in a video earlier this summer, maybe like 2 weeks ago, most people are underrating Higgins' 2022 season because his points per game numbers are artificially low. Sites are going to show around 11.5 half PPR points per game since they're counting his 10 snap game with 0 targets against Baltimore, his 1 snap game against Cleveland in those numbers. If you don't include those games where he effectively did not play and you just look at the other games, how productive was he when he was playing, then he averaged 13.1 points per game, ranked 12th in points per game last season. And I want to touch on that for a second because I think it's going to be like in the back of people's minds when drafting the season, especially those of you who rostered Higgins last year. I completely understand that those games did happen. Like, I'm removing them from the points per game, but they did happen. Many of you started Tee Higgins in those games, which really hurt your chances of winning in those weeks. And so it's going to be in the back of your mind when you're drafting, deciding between Tee Higgins and these other two that we're going to talk about today. And you're obviously going to have a negative view of him in your mind. But while those games were super unfortunate, they don't really help us evaluate him moving forward. Injuries happen, and they can happen to any player at any time. So it's brutal when someone either gets hurt right away or enters the game more injured than we knew they were, but we still have to kind of evaluate these players when they're healthy because almost every single player has the exact same chance of being injured. And when healthy, Higgins has been great. He was just 23 all of last season, playing behind Jamar Chase, and yet he averaged over 73 receiving yards per game, scored 7 touchdowns in 14 weeks. That's his second straight season with over 73 receiving yards per game, at least a 67% catch rate, which is incredibly high for a non-slot wide receiver. For slot wide receivers, yeah, they can hit that. They can get to 70, over 70% sometimes. But Higgins plays on the outside, and he gets a lot of targets deep downfield. A 67% catch rate is extraordinary. In fact, if you look at his 3-year career and you exclude the games where he played less than 30% of the snaps and you include all playoff games as well, he's got 48 career games. In those games, he's averaged 5.1 receptions, 72 receiving yards, 7.8 touchdowns per 17 weeks. That's high-end wide receiver 2 production that is exactly what I would expect from him this season, exactly how I view Tee Higgins. While Jamar Chase is healthy, Higgins is simply not a wide receiver 1 in fantasy. He's going to have some spiked weeks. I would be surprised if he didn't have 2 or 3 weeks this season where he was a top 5 fantasy wide receiver. He has a very high ceiling because of the offense that he's on and how good of a player he is. And Chase could obviously always get hurt like we saw last season, and Higgins will be a wide receiver 1 in those weeks. Chase missed weeks 8 through 12 last season. Higgins up to 15.5 points per game in those games. Obviously, that is wide receiver 1 production. But again, no matter how much better of a player, let's say Higgins improves, going into this season, into his 4th year, no matter how much better he gets, Jamar Chase is still their number 1 wide receiver. And so Higgins is a number 2 in fantasy in the weeks that Chase is healthy, just because of how good Jamar Chase is, how many targets he commands. There's only so many that can now go to Tee Higgins. Ultimately, I have him projected to finish very similarly as he was per game last season when healthy. 87 receptions, just over 1,200 yards, and 7.8 touchdowns, which is 12.4 half PPR points per game, and is my wide receiver 12 overall. Now, I think a lot of you requested this breakdown because you can say many of the same things about DeVonta Smith. A.J. Brown is the better wide receiver than DeVonta Smith. And so when Brown is healthy, DeVonta Smith is a wide receiver 2. Smith played every single game last season, finished with 95 receptions for just under 1,200 yards and 7 touchdowns. And basically nothing has changed this season, so I have him projected for 88 receptions, just under 1,150 yards, and 6.7 receiving touchdowns. So a very slight pullback in the numbers. There's always a chance that he misses a game, always a chance that, let's be honest, the offense was incredible last season. Maybe they just regress a tad, but still expecting elite numbers from DeVonta Smith. So the question really is, if both Tee Higgins and DeVonta Smith are wide receiver 2s while the wide receiver 1 is healthy, which one would we rather roster? And personally, I always think about ceiling, not the ceiling if there's an injury, because, I mean, let's be honest, if A.J. Brown gets injured, if Jamar Chase gets injured, the ceiling for both these players is top 5. They could be top 5 wide receivers. I don't think there's much differentiating there. But I would say ceiling in terms of which offense do we think could really go off and result in not only their wide receiver 1 finishing, top 5, top 3, number 1 if it's Jamar Chase, but also having their wide receiver 2 finish inside the top 10, because we've seen that happen plenty of times before where an offense does really, really well and you have 2 top 10 wide receivers. And to me, the answer is definitely the Bengals, because think about it. The Eagles already went off last season. They finished 2nd in points per game, 3rd in yards per game, compared to the Bengals, who finished 7th in points per game, 11th in yards per game. So if one of these teams has room to go up, then it's the Bengals. And then we think about, the identity of each offense, we gain a little bit more confidence in the Bengals, right? The Bengals are a team that wants to throw the ball a lot, whereas the Eagles are a team that wants to maybe throw a lot to begin with, but they want to get up and then play slow and run the ball. So any extra yardage this season coming from the Eagles is unlikely to come through the receiving game, whereas for the Bengals, if they enter the top 3 in scoring, top 3 in yardage, well, a lot of that extra production that we didn't see last season is probably going to come in the passing game. It's pretty unlikely that Joe Mixon and Chase Brown just go off this season and that, they have more total yards, but a ton of them are coming on the ground. That wouldn't make a whole lot of sense. These offenses, and since Higgins already outproduced Smith on a per game basis last season and does project for around 12 more half PPR points this season, I feel pretty good sticking with the projections, ranking Higgins ahead of DeVonta Smith. So that's how I'd rank those two. But what about Chris Olave? Because he's a little bit different, right? He's not a number 2. He doesn't have basically all of those same things we just talked about between those two, so we have to break him down a little bit differently. Olave is coming off a rookie season where he finished 4th in Rookie of the Year voting. He caught 72 passes, a little under 1,050 yards, and 4 touchdowns, even after missing 2 games and catching passes from mostly Andy Dalton. Now, the main concern with Olave is twofold. One is volume. The Saints actually ranked 26th in pass attempts per game last season, which was behind even the Eagles, and they're likely going to run the ball a lot this season. This was easily a bottom 10 team in plays per game last year, and I really do see downside risk that they're going to play even slower, run the ball even more this season. Especially, what if Kamara avoids a long suspension? Maybe it's only 2 or 4 games. They'll have, for most of the season, 3 running backs that are fully capable of very large workloads. They're going to want to mix all of these running backs in. The second downside risk with Olave is his chemistry with Carr. Now, I think we're going to kind of get an answer to that, in July, in August, once we get into the camp, get into the preseason, we have a lot more reports of how they're looking, and maybe this concern will completely go away, but it's at least possible that Carr and Olave, maybe not even for the full season, but for part of the season, take a little bit of time to fully get on the same page, and that's enough to move him behind Higgins and Smith. But here's why I'm willing to kind of push those to the side, Chris Olave was an incredibly high-end prospect coming into the league. So he wasn't some breakout where, we weren't really expecting high-end production. We knew he was going to be very good. Maybe didn't know how he was going to be like as good as he was last season, but we knew he was going to be good. And then he has a rookie season that I think is being a little bit overlooked just because of, how good Garrett Wilson did. Garrett Wilson was incredible. Garrett Wilson won Rookie of the Year. And so people don't look at Olave the same way. But as per Matt Harmon, whose site you should definitely check out, receptionperception.com, Olave ran all but one route at an above average success rate last season. And that one route, the post, came at an average success rate. He was dominant as a rookie on routes, against man coverage, against zone coverage. I really think that had he not suffered the concussion in week 5, which forced him out of week 5, forced him to miss week 6, then a hamstring pull, which forced him out of week 15 and forced him to miss week 16, I think he definitely would have won Rookie of the Year. And if that had occurred, he would be going in the early second round. I don't know if it would be ahead of Garrett Wilson, but it would be right there. But because those two things happened, those two very, very minor injuries that caused him to effectively miss 3 games that people aren't really considering when they look at those really, really good rookie season numbers, I think he would be going next to Garrett Wilson. But because he didn't, he's not going in that same range. And if we think about the quarterback change, he's transitioning to Derek Carr, who's obviously not some stud quarterback, but he just threw 180 pass attempts to his number 1 wide receiver last season. And he caused Adams, who's, a phenomenal wide receiver, to have his highest yards per reception season by 2 yards per reception. That is nuts. Like, a receiver that's played in as many seasons as Adams has had up and downs, obviously. And to have the best season of your career in yards per reception by 2 per reception in a year where you had 180 targets is incredible, right? He was really pushing the ball downfield and just overloading everything to Adams. And now, I'm not expecting Olave to replicate Adams' numbers last season. That would be on the high end of what we should expect. But I do want us all to realize that Chris Olave is significantly better than Michael Thomas at this point of their respective careers. And that Derek Carr just showed us last season he is willing to not only push the ball deep downfield consistently, but he's willing to lock into his number 1 target, and that is definitely Chris Olave. And if we go back to our question earlier of, I lean upside. I lean, if this pick hits, who could win me the league? And if we are thinking about that among the 3 players, I don't see how the answer is not Chris Olave. His success rates were mind-blowing as a rookie, and he's in the best spot among the 3 as the clear number 1 wide receiver on his own team. And for those of you who are like, no, Michael Thomas will come back this season. If he can somehow get healthy, he's going to be great. Like, Michael Thomas is probably cooked at this point. He had a 34% success rate versus man last season, 17% success rate versus zone. He's already 30 years old. He only has 610 total yards in the last 3 seasons combined. I mean, Olave had more than half that total in his first month as a rookie and posted elite success rates versus both man and zone coverage last season. Olave is unquestionably the wide receiver 1 in New Orleans, and he deserves to be the wide receiver 1 in these 3 rankings. So my rankings for these 3, Chris Olave number 1, Tee Higgins number 2, DeVonta Smith number 3. So, as I said at the beginning of the video, let me know who you want me to break down next week in the comment section below and upvote the responses you agree with. Also, if you want to see my exact rankings and projections for every single player, you can see that on my website, thefantasyfootballadvice.com. I'll be back tomorrow to talk about the players with the highest ceiling this season. Saturday, to go over the players rising the most by ADP. And then Sunday, to go over another optimal underdog strategy. That, my friends, is in this one. Hope you all enjoyed. If you did, how about hitting the like button? How about subscribing to the channel if you're new here? Thanks for watching.